My name is Elellanar Grant, and the night my husband celebrated the biggest promotion of his life, he asked me not to be there. I was standing in the parking lot of the Delta Hotel in Mississauga snow, just beginning to fall in soft, hesitant flakes, watching colleagues step out of black SUVs and taxis in their winter coats and polished shoes. Through the tall glass windows of the ballroom, I could see the glow of chandeliers and the flicker of candles on round tables dressed in white linen. My husband Thomas was inside. I was not. He had told me 3 days earlier in our kitchen, over a quiet cup of tea, that it would be better if I stayed home. "It's just corporate optics," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Senior leadership. A different crowd." I remember the kettle clicking off behind me and the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence he left hanging between us. 32 years of marriage. And suddenly, I was not the right image. I did not argue. I did not cry. I nodded and asked whether he'd like me to press his Navy suit. That is how women of my generation were trained to survive disappointment, by folding it neatly and placing it in a drawer. But what he did not tell me, what I learned later, was worse. His parents had helped organize the event, and they had invited his former fiancée, not me, the same woman they had once described as more suited to his ambitions, the one with the MBA from Queens, the polished accent, the confidence in boardrooms, the one who apparently still fit the story they preferred. I found out by accident. A neighbor from down the street mentioned seeing the event listing on LinkedIn. Someone had posted about reconnecting with old friends. There was a photograph attached to planning committee snapshot. His mother standing beside that woman, both smiling as though time had folded in on itself. I stared at the screen for a long while before setting my phone down. It is a strange thing to be erased from your own life. Thomas works for a national logistics firm. He started in operations in his early 30s, working long hours at distribution centers outside Toronto, sometimes commuting through snowstorms along the 401 before dawn. Back then, we lived in a modest townhouse in Brampton. The mortgage was tight. Our son was in primary school. Our daughter had asthma, and winters were hard on her. I worked part-time at a local elementary school as an administrative assistant. It was steady work with benefits. I packed lunches at 6 in the morning, attended parent-teacher meetings alone when Thomas was traveling, and learned how to stretch a grocery budget when promotions were promised but delayed. When he decided to pursue his executive certification, we used the small inheritance my mother had left me, a simple gold bracelet and a few savings bonds. I sold the bracelet quietly at a jeweler in Etobicoke. I never told Thomas how much it had meant to me. I told him only that the timing felt right. We hosted his supervisors for dinner more times than I can count. I ironed tablecloths, prepared roast beef with Yorkshire pudding, poured Ontario wine carefully into stemmed glasses we'd received as a wedding gift. I listened politely while they spoke about supply chains and expansion into Western Canada. His parents always preferred her. "She understands his world," his mother once said at Thanksgiving, carving turkey with sharp, decisive movements. "It's not personal, Eleanor. It's just compatibility." Compatibility, as though marriage were a business merger. Over the years, I learned to swallow those remarks with cranberry sauce and keep passing the gravy. When Thomas began rising quickly within the company, the invitations to corporate galas increased. I attended at first. I wore simple dresses from Hudson's Bay sensible heels, pearls my father had given me when I turned 40. I was never flashy, but I was proud. Somewhere along the way, pride shifted into something quieter usefulness perhaps. 3 days before the party, he came home later than usual. Snowbanks lined the driveway, hardened and gray from passing traffic. He set his briefcase down carefully, as though bracing for something fragile. "The promotion is official," he said. "Regional vice president." I hugged him. I truly did. I felt the years of effort settle into that moment. "I'm proud of you," I told him, and I meant it. Then he cleared his throat. "The celebration is Friday. At the Delta." I smiled. "What should I wear?" That was when he looked away. "It might be better if you didn't come." He explained it in careful phrases, the senior executives flying in from Vancouver and Calgary, the board members, the need for a certain image. "It's just this once," he added. "Please understand." Understand what? That 3 decades of shared struggle could be edited out of the final chapter. I did not confront him about his ex. I did not mention the photograph. I wanted to see how far silence could stretch before it snapped. So there I was, that Friday evening, engine idling in the parking lot, watching the life we built unfold without me. My coat was buttoned up to my chin. The snow was heavier now. I could have driven home. I almost did. Instead, I stepped out of the car and stood for a moment beneath the cold Ontario sky, looking at the reflection of chandeliers in the glass. I stayed silent. I left quietly. But silence does not mean surrender. Inside that ballroom, speeches were about to begin. And when the party began, everything changed. Snow followed me all the way home that night. I drove slowly along Hurontario Street, windshield wipers, keeping time with the thoughts I could no longer push aside. I had not gone inside the hotel. I had stood there long enough to feel the sting in my cheeks and the deeper sting in my chest. And then I had turned the key and driven away. When I reached our house, the porch light was still on. I left it that way. Inside, everything looked as it always had. The hallway rug, slightly worn where Thomas's shoes usually rested. The framed photographs lining the wall, our children at Niagara Falls Christmas mornings, in wool sweaters, camping trips near Algonquin. 32 years of visible proof. And yet that evening I felt invisible. It is a strange realization at 63 to discover that you have become background scenery in your own marriage. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table. I did not turn on the television. I did not call anyone. I simply let the silence settle around me. In that quiet, memories returned, not the dramatic kind, but the ordinary ones that build a life. We married in 1991 in a small church in Oakville. I wore a simple lace dress, my aunt altered by hand. Thomas was ambitious, even then. He spoke about growth, about building something substantial. I believed in him. I believed in us. Our first apartment was a basement suite with low ceilings and one small window that faced a brick wall. We saved every dollar we could. I remember walking to No Frills with a cloth bag and calculating whether we could afford fresh berries that week. When Thomas was offered a junior management position in Winnipeg, we moved without hesitation. I left my steady position at the school board and found temporary work at a medical clinic. The winters were sharp and long. I learned to plug in the car heater and scrape frost before sunrise, while our son slept bundled in layers. Thomas worked 12-hour days, sometimes more. I told myself it was temporary. When his certification opportunity came up years later, the tuition felt impossible. We had just refinanced the mortgage. Our daughter needed orthodontics, but he wanted it so badly. My mother had passed away the previous spring. She left me a small amount of savings and a gold bracelet she had worn most of her adult life. It wasn't extravagant, but it was hers. I remember sitting on the edge of our bed bracelet in my palm, turning it slowly in the light. The following week, I sold it. I told Thomas we had enough to cover the first semester. He hugged me tightly and said he would make it worth it. I believed him. I hosted dinners when his supervisors came through town. I ironed tablecloths, polished cutlery, and arranged flowers from the local grocery store in simple glass vases. I learned the language of his industry so I could follow conversations and contribute politely. His parents attended those dinners sometimes. They were always civil, always courteous, but there was a quiet comparison lingering in the room. His former fiancée, Caroline, had been part of his life during university. They ended things amicably when she accepted a position overseas. His mother often mentioned her accomplishments as though reading a resume aloud. "She's doing very well in Toronto now," she once said, while sipping wine in our dining room. "Very accomplished. She always had that executive presence." I smiled and cleared plates. Executive presence. I had presence too, just not the kind that came with a title. Over the years, Thomas's promotions came slowly, then more quickly. We moved back to Ontario. We paid off the mortgage. The children grew up, graduated, moved into their own lives. We began to speak about retirement savings, about perhaps spending winters in British Columbia one day. Somewhere during that climb, I noticed subtle shifts. At company events, introductions shortened. I became my wife instead of Eleanor, who kept everything together while I was traveling. It was small at first, easy to ignore. Then there were the jokes from his father. "You know how these corporate functions are," he would say. "They're about image." I never imagined image would one day exclude me entirely. The week before the party, I overheard Thomas on the phone with his mother. I wasn't trying to listen. I was in the hallway, folding laundry. "It's just easier this way," he said quietly. Easier for whom? I waited for him to explain it to me fully. He never did. When I learned that Caroline had been invited not as a spouse, not as a colleague, but as a guest of honor, seated at the head table, something inside me settled into clarity. This was not about corporate optics. This was about rewriting history. At some point, my role had become inconvenient to the version of success he wanted displayed under chandeliers and applause. That night, after returning home from the parking lot, I sat at the kitchen table and allowed myself one honest question. Had I mistaken loyalty for silence all these years? There is a difference between supporting someone and disappearing for them. I had never asked Thomas to choose between ambition and marriage. I believed we carried both together. Yet in that ballroom, he was standing without me, and perhaps without the full truth of how he got there. I did not cry. Instead, I opened a drawer where I keep old documents, relocation papers, mortgage agreements, copies of the co-signed business loan from 15 years ago, when his division nearly collapsed during restructuring. My name was on every one of them. If the evening was about image, then perhaps it was time the full picture appeared. The party was already underway by then. Speeches were likely beginning, applause rising. And for the first time in decades, I felt something different from hurt. I felt steady. By the time the applause began inside that ballroom, I was sitting at our kitchen table with a stack of documents spread out in front of me. The house was quiet. Our children were grown living in Ottawa and Calgary. The only sound was the steady ticking of the wall clock above the stove and the faint hum of traffic passing at the end of our street. Outside, snow gathered along the curb in soft ridges. At 7:42 p.m., my phone rang. It was Martin Hughes, one of Thomas's longtime colleagues. We had hosted him and his wife for dinner many times over the years. He is the kind of man who always removes his shoes at the door and thanks you twice for a meal. "Eleanor," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "I thought I'd see you tonight." There it was. "I'm not attending," I replied calmly. A pause. "Oh," he said. "Thomas mentioned you were traveling." Traveling. I looked around our kitchen. The oak cabinets we refinished ourselves. The magnet-covered refrigerator. The teapot still warm on the counter. "No," I said gently. "I'm home." Another pause. This one longer. "Well," Martin cleared his throat. "There's been a bit of confusion here. I assumed you were seated at the head table." Head table. The word settled like a weight. "Who is seated there?" I asked, though I already knew. He hesitated. "Caroline is here." He did not need to say her last name. I thanked him for calling. He sounded uncomfortable, loyal but uneasy. After we hung up, I did not feel the sharp sting I expected. Instead, something steadier took hold, a quiet certainty. For decades, I had stood beside Thomas without needing recognition. I had believed that partnership was understood even when unspoken. But that night, the narrative unfolding in that ballroom suggested something else entirely. I reached for my phone again. There are moments in life when anger drives people to spectacle. This was not one of them. I did not want a scene. I wanted accuracy. Thomas's company prides itself on governance and transparency. It is mentioned in every annual report. I knew that because I had proofread some of those reports at our dining room table when deadlines loomed. I searched the company website and located the contact information for human resources, specifically the senior compliance officer responsible for executive oversight. Her name was listed publicly. I had met her once at a holiday function years earlier. I hesitated only briefly before drafting an email. It was not emotional. It was factual. I explained that I was the spouse of Thomas Grant, newly appointed regional vice president. I noted that company newsletters over the years had publicly acknowledged family support in leadership features. I attached copies of previous internal publications where I had been mentioned by name. I also attached documentation of the relocation agreements I had co-signed, the financial guarantee we provided during the 2008 restructuring, and the business loan I had supported when his division faced cuts. I wrote one final paragraph carefully. I understand that tonight's event celebrates professional achievement. I am proud of my husband's work. However, I have been informed that I am being represented as absent due to travel, which is inaccurate. I believe in transparency. If family contribution is referenced in any official capacity, I ask that it reflect the truth. I did not accuse. I did not demand. I pressed send at 8:03 p.m. Then I sat back and waited. Inside the Delta Ballroom, speeches were underway. I imagined the room white linen tablecloths, glasses clinking, the low murmur of polite laughter. I could picture Thomas in his navy suit, standing straighter than usual, accepting congratulations. Perhaps he believed the omission would pass unnoticed. Perhaps he convinced himself it was harmless. At 8:27 p.m., my phone vibrated. It was not Thomas. It was the compliance officer. Her tone was measured and professional. "Mrs. Grant," she began, "thank you for reaching out. I was not aware of any misrepresentation regarding your attendance." I explained calmly that I had no intention of disrupting the evening. I simply wanted clarity. She thanked me again. I could hear the faint echo of a large room behind her, voices, the distant hum of a microphone. "I will look into this immediately," she said. That was all. I set the phone down. I did not know exactly what would happen next. I had not requested intervention. I had not asked for apology. I had asked for accuracy. 10 minutes later, Martin texted me. Something just shifted, he wrote. I did not respond. Another message followed. They're updating the slide deck. Slide deck. During executive promotions, the company presents a short biography. On screen, career highlights, milestones, acknowledgments. For years, Thomas's biography included a simple line, supported by his wife, Elellanar, through multiple relocations and leadership transitions. I wondered what it said tonight. At 8:46 p.m., Martin called again. You might want to know, he said quietly. Your name just appeared on the screen. I closed my eyes. He continued. The CEO asked where you were seated. Thomas hesitated. Hesitated. That was the word. I pictured the room falling slightly still, forks pausing above plates, the quiet awareness that something was amiss. The compliance officer stepped up beside the stage. Martin added, there was a brief adjustment to the remarks. Adjustment. The narrative was no longer entirely under Thomas's control. I'm sorry, Elellanar, Martin said gently. You should have been here from the start. I thanked him. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel vindication. I felt steady. In that ballroom, the version of success being presented had been corrected, not dramatically, not publicly humiliating, but undeniably. The party had begun without me, but the story had changed. The house felt different after Martin's call. Not louder, not brighter, just altered as though the air itself had shifted direction. I did not turn on the lights in the living room. I remained at the kitchen table, the documents still spread before me. The teacup now cold. Outside, the snowfall thickened, softening the sharp edges of the street. It was nearing 9 o'clock. Inside that ballroom, something subtle but undeniable had taken place. Martin texted again at 9:02 p.m. The CEO asked him directly, Is your wife here tonight? I could picture it clearly. The microphone slightly echoing. The polite, expectant smiles. The assumption that the answer would be simple. Thomas is not a man who enjoys being caught off guard. He prepares meticulously for presentations. He rehearses speeches under his breath while shaving. But there is no rehearsal for truth when it arrives uninvited. What did he say? I typed back. She wasn't able to attend, Martin replied. Then the compliance officer clarified that you were not traveling. There it was, not dramatic, not explosive, but precise. In corporate environments, precision carries weight. The company's culture has always emphasized transparency. It is written into their code of conduct. Any public misrepresentation, even minor, reflects poorly at the executive level. It is less about scandal and more about credibility. I imagine the CEO's expression, not anger, but calculation. And why is she not here? I can almost hear him asking. No one expects that question at a celebration. Martin's next message came a few minutes later. Caroline excused herself. I sat very still. It was never about humiliating her. She had built her own life. She had her own accomplishments. But even she must have sensed the imbalance in the room. To sit at a head table beside a married man while his wife was publicly corrected into existence that is not comfortable territory. I imagined Thomas standing there, the spotlight warm against his face, applause fading into uncertainty. For years, I had watched him navigate difficult negotiations. I had admired his ability to remain composed. That night, he faced something he could not manage with a spreadsheet or performance metric. He faced omission. An omission, once illuminated, becomes conspicuous. At 9:18 p.m., my phone rang again. This time, it was Thomas. I let it ring once more before answering. His voice was lower than usual. Elellanar, he said, why did you contact compliance? He did not shout. That would have been easier to respond to. I contacted them to correct an inaccuracy, I replied evenly. A pause. You embarrassed me, he said quietly. The word lingered between us. Did I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. You could have spoken to me, he added. I did, I said gently. 3 days ago, when I asked what I should wear. Silence. I could hear the faint murmur of the ballroom behind him, music starting conversations, resuming the sound of cutlery against china. I thought it would be simpler, he said finally. Simpler? There it was again. For whom I asked. He did not answer. I did not accuse you, I continued calmly. I did not request that the event be altered. I simply ensured that the public record reflected the truth. Another long silence. I need to go, he said. Of course, I replied. We hung up. I did not feel victorious. Revenge, if that is what some might call it, did not feel sharp or triumphant. It felt measured. What shifted that night was not the promotion. Thomas remained regional vice president. The company did not revoke anything. There was no public reprimand. What shifted was the room. Executives notice hesitation. They notice discrepancies. They notice when a narrative does not align. Later, Martin would tell me that several board members asked casual but pointed questions during dessert. Not accusations, inquiries. Strange she couldn't make it, someone said. After all those relocations, another added. Thomas could not pretend I had never existed. The slide deck had been updated mid-presentation. My name restored. A brief acknowledgement inserted. It was not dramatic, but it was visible. In professional settings, visibility is everything. By the time Thomas left the hotel that night, the tone had changed. The celebration had become more subdued, not ruined, simply recalibrated. He returned home close to 11. I heard the garage door open, the engine shut off, the heavy sound of boots against the mat in the hallway. I remained seated at the kitchen table. He entered slowly, removing his coat. Snow clung to his shoulders. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked tired, not angry, not defeated, just confronted. I didn't expect that, he said quietly. Neither did I replied. The house held the weight of everything unsaid for decades. What changed that night was not his title. It was the understanding that silence has limits. He stood there in the kitchen for a long moment, snow melting from the cuffs of his coat onto the hardwood floor. The house was warm, the faint scent of chamomile still in the air, but the space between us felt unfamiliar. I rose quietly and handed him a towel for the melted snow. Thank you, he said automatically. He removed his boots and set them beside the door, lining them up carefully, as he always has. Even in discomfort, Thomas maintains order. I poured fresh hot water into the kettle. Tea, I asked. He nodded. We moved through the motions of routine, the kind that have held a marriage together, through decades. Fill the kettle place, the mugs, reach for the sugar, without asking. Familiar actions in unfamiliar circumstances. When we finally sat across from each other at the kitchen table, he did not meet my eyes immediately. The CEO pulled me aside, he said, after the speech. I waited. He asked why my wife wasn't present for such a significant milestone. And what did you tell him? I asked calmly. Thomas inhaled slowly. I said you had chosen not to attend. That word again, chosen. I did not choose to be excluded, I said quietly. He rubbed his forehead, a gesture I've seen when budgets go wrong or forecasts fail. I thought it would be easier, he repeated. For whom I asked once more. He looked at me then. For everyone, he said, though the words lacked conviction. I let the silence stretch. After 32 years, you learn that silence can invite truth if you do not rush to fill it. It wasn't about you, he added quickly. It was about perception. I nodded slightly. And what is the perception of a wife who supports her husband for 3 decades? He did not answer immediately. My parents suggested it might be awkward, he said at last. Awkward, I repeated. Caroline has connections. She's on a board in Toronto. They felt her presence would reflect well. And mine would not. He hesitated. That hesitation carried more weight than any direct insult. I never meant to diminish you, he said, his voice softer now. But you did, I replied. There are moments in a marriage when the truth is not explosive, but undeniable. This was one of them. When did I become something to manage? I asked. Something to explain away. He leaned back in his chair, as though the question had physical weight. You've always been steady, he said. Steady. The word was meant as praise, but it sounded like invisibility. Steady doesn't mean replaceable, I said quietly. He looked down at his hands. I didn't think it through, he admitted. No, I agreed. You thought about optics. You did not think about partnership. The clock ticked steadily behind him. I was embarrassed, he said, after a long pause. Not by you, by the situation. Embarrassed that your wife might not fit the room, I asked. He shook his head, embarrassed that I allowed it to happen. That was the first honest sentence of the evening. I didn't contact compliance to embarrass you, I said calmly. I contacted them because I refused to be erased. He absorbed that. I would never erase you, he said quietly. You did, I replied. Just not permanently. There is a difference between anger and clarity. I did not feel anger. I felt clarity. For 32 years, I continued. I believed we were building something together. I never asked to stand at the front of the room, but I also never agreed to stand outside of it. He exhaled slowly. My father said appearances matter at this level, he said. And what appearance did tonight create? I asked. He did not answer. Instead, he looked around the kitchen at the photographs, the worn wood table, the quiet evidence of a shared life. When the CEO asked where you were seated, he said I realized I had no answer that sounded right. Because there wasn't one, I replied. He nodded faintly. I felt small, he admitted. That surprised me. Small, I asked. Yes, he said, as though I had tried to polish one part of my life and ended up scratching the surface. That image lingered. Ambition can polish a career, but it can also scrape away what made it possible. I never asked you to choose between career and marriage, I said. I supported both. I know, he said softly. Do you, I asked. He looked at me fully, then, and for the first time that evening, I saw something I had not expected. Regret. Not performative regret, not defensive explanation, genuine recognition. I do, he said. The kettle clicked softly as it cooled. I don't want to compete with your past, I said gently. And I don't want to compete with your parents' expectations. I want respect. He nodded. I owe you that, he said. Respect. It sounds simple, but in long marriages, respect must be renewed, not assumed. The snow outside had stopped falling. The streetlights reflected off the fresh layer, casting a pale glow through the window. What happens now? He asked quietly. That depends, I replied, on whether tonight was a mistake or a pattern. He swallowed. It was a mistake, he said. I studied him carefully. 32 years teaches you how to read a face. I'm tired, he added. Not of you, of trying to meet expectations that were never ours. That sentence shifted something. Ambition had carried him far, but perhaps it had also carried him away from himself. We will talk about this properly, I said, Not just tonight. He nodded. I don't want you hidden, he said quietly. I never asked to be hidden, I replied. We sat there a while longer, the tension softening into something more honest. The drive home from the hotel had likely been longer for him than the kilometers suggested. We did not resolve everything that night. Marriage does not work that way. 32 years of habits and assumptions do not dissolve over a single pot of tea. But something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to open the door to something honest. The next morning, Thomas woke earlier than usual. I heard him moving around downstairs, before the sun had fully risen. When I came into the kitchen, he was already dressed, not in his usual work suit, but in a sweater and slacks. His laptop was open on the table. I've drafted something, he said quietly. He turned the screen toward me. It was an email addressed to the CEO and the executive team. In it, he acknowledged that the celebration the previous evening had not accurately reflected the support structure behind his career. He clarified that I had not been traveling. He stated that my contribution over decades of relocations, financial partnership, and family stability had been foundational to his advancement. There was no blame, no excuses, just ownership. I should have done this before, he said. I read the message carefully. It was measured and sincere, not defensive, not overly emotional, professional, but personal enough to matter. Send it, I said. He did. Then he made another call, this time to his parents. I did not listen to the entire conversation. I stepped into the living room and gave him privacy. But voices carry in houses that have shared decades of history. I won't allow this again, I heard him say firmly. Eleanor is my wife, not an accessory. There was a pause. His mother's voice rose faintly through the receiver. I could not make out the words, but I recognized the tone, offended, perhaps defensive. This isn't about image, he continued. It's about respect. When he ended the call, he looked older than he had the day before, not physically, but in awareness. That was overdue, he said. Yes, I replied gently. Later that afternoon, he asked if I would be willing to attend a smaller executive dinner the following week. Not a public gala, not a ballroom, just the senior leadership team and their spouses at a restaurant downtown. You'll be introduced properly, he said, by name. The word properly lingered. I'll consider it, I replied. He nodded, accepting that reconciliation is not automatic. Over the next few days, subtle confirmations arrived. A response from the CEO, thanking Thomas for the clarification. A brief internal newsletter update acknowledging the invaluable support of Elellanar Grant throughout years of growth and transition. It was not grand, but it was visible. The following Thursday, we drove together to the restaurant, a quiet place near the waterfront in Toronto. The lake was calm that evening, the air crisp, but no longer heavy with snow. Spring was beginning to loosen winter's grip. I wore a simple navy dress, nothing elaborate, just something that felt like myself. When we entered, several executives stood to greet us. Thomas did not rush ahead. He did not introduce me as an afterthought. This is my wife Eleanor, he said clearly. We've built everything together. Not my wife alone. Eleanor. There is power in being named. The evening was comfortable. Conversations flowed naturally. No one mentioned the previous party directly, but I sensed an awareness, not scandal, not gossip, simply recognition. One executive's spouse leaned toward me at one point and said quietly, "It's nice to finally meet you. I've heard about you for years." Finally, that word felt different from delayed. On the drive home, the city lights reflecting off Lake Ontario, Thomas reached for my hand across the console. "I'm sorry," he said again. Not hurried, not pressured. "I know," I replied. An apology, to be meaningful, must cost something. It must require the surrender of pride. That week had cost him pride. It had required him to confront not only his parents' expectations, but his own quiet compromises. For me, the lesson was different. I had learned that silence can be strength, but only when it is chosen, not imposed. Silence that allows erasure is not strength. It is disappearance. We began attending a few sessions with a counselor in Oakville, not because we were on the brink of collapse, but because we had both realized that long marriages need maintenance. Ambition changes people. Age changes priorities. If we were to grow older together, honestly, we needed to speak what we had once swallowed. One evening after counseling, Thomas said something that stayed with me. "I spent so many years trying to prove myself." He said that I forgot who stood beside me while I did. It was not a dramatic revelation, but it was sincere. Respect, I have learned, is not automatic in long relationships. It must be renewed intentionally. The promotion remained. His responsibilities increased. But something quieter had taken root in our home, a recalibration. I had not stormed into a ballroom. I had not shouted. I had not humiliated. I had simply refused to disappear. Spring arrived slowly that year. The snowbanks receded into shallow gray patches along the curb. The maples on our street began to bud, tentative and pale green. After months of cold, the air felt lighter, as though it had decided to forgive winter for lingering too long. Thomas and I started taking evening walks again. Not long ones just around the neighborhood, past familiar houses and tidy lawns. We had walked these same streets when our children were small, pushing strollers over cracked sidewalks. Now we walked side by side, not rushing, not performing for anyone. The promotion had settled into routine. His schedule was fuller, more meetings, more travel, but something in him had softened. He introduced me differently now, not simply my wife. Elellanar. At first, the distinction felt almost too small to matter, but it did. Names restore presence. One afternoon, about a month after the party, we were invited to a small retirement luncheon for one of his longtime colleagues. It was held at a modest banquet hall in Oakville. Nothing elaborate round tables, coffee urns near the back, the familiar hum of conversation among people who had shared decades of work. As we entered, Thomas placed his hand lightly at the small of my back, not possessive, not performative, steady. When it came time for speeches, he was asked to say a few words. He stood at the front of the room, adjusting the microphone slightly. "I've been fortunate in my career," he began, "but I've also been reminded recently that no one builds success alone." There was no grand announcement, no spectacle, just acknowledgement. "My wife, Elellanar," he continued, glancing toward me, "has carried more than her share over the years." I felt warmth rise in my chest, not pride exactly, but recognition. Afterward, one of the retired managers approached me. "You handled that situation with grace," she said quietly. I hadn't realized how widely the story had traveled, not in scandalous whispers, but in respectful observation. Grace. It wasn't revenge in the dramatic sense people often imagine. There were no shattered glasses, no public accusations. What changed that night was quieter and perhaps more lasting. Thomas had believed ambition required refinement, that certain parts of life should be polished and others tucked away. But ambition without loyalty leaves a hollow space. We spoke about it many times in the weeks that followed. I thought I was protecting the evening, he admitted once. I didn't realize I was undermining us. Protection that requires concealment isn't protection, I replied gently. He nodded. The truth is, long marriages evolve. In our 20s and 30s, survival mattered most. Paying bills, raising children, building stability. In our 40s and 50s, advancement took center stage. Somewhere along that climb, it becomes easy to assume partnership is fixed and unshakable. It is not. It requires tending. I have thought often about silence since that night in the parking lot. Silence can be powerful. It allows space for reflection. It prevents unnecessary damage. But silence must never become consent to be diminished. I did not shout. I did not humiliate. I simply corrected the record. And in doing so, I corrected something deeper in our marriage. One evening in late May, Thomas and I drove down to the lakeshore and walked along the water. The sun was setting, casting long reflections across Lake Ontario. Couples strolled past us, some holding hands, some walking separately, but in rhythm. "Do you regret sending that email?" he asked quietly. I considered the question carefully. "No," I said. "Do you?" He shook his head. "It forced me to look at myself honestly," he admitted. Honesty can feel uncomfortable at first, but without it, respect erodes quietly. We stopped near a bench overlooking the water. The air smelled faintly of spring and distant rain. "I don't want to be celebrated without you," he said. "I don't want to disappear for you," I replied. We stood there in agreement, not dramatic, not theatrical, just aligned. That is what changed that night. Not the promotion, not the company. US, for anyone listening who has spent years supporting quietly, who has stood behind the scenes while others took the stage, remember, this loyalty deserves visibility. Respect should never be conditional on convenience. If you find yourself in a moment where you feel erased, do not rush to anger. Seek clarity. Speak truth calmly. Restore your name where it belongs. Long marriages are not built on appearances. They are built on partnership, renewed again and again. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to reflect on the quiet strengths in your own life. Share this with someone who may need encouragement to stand steadily without shouting. And if you believe in stories that honor dignity and growth, consider listening again. Sometimes the strongest voice in the room is the one that speaks softly and refuses to disappear.